history is supposed to move forward in clean, logical steps. First comes survival, then agriculture, then writing, science, and complex belief systems. That is the story we are taught. But every so often, a fragment from the distant past refuses to fit, hinting at a timeline that feels wrong, misplaced, almost edited. Ancient Sumer is one of those fragments. Long before Egypt raised its pyramids, Sumerian tablets describe advanced mathematics, detailed astronomy, complex legal systems, and a written language that appears suddenly without a clear period of experimentation. According to the accepted timeline, this knowledge should not exist so early. Civilizations are meant to crawl before they walk. Sumer somehow arrived already running. This raises an uncomfortable question most history books quietly avoid. What if our timeline is not incomplete, but rearranged? What if Egypt was not the beginning, but a continuation? And what if something even older stood behind Sumer itself, supplying knowledge humanity was never meant to remember? Historians often explain these inconsistencies away as coincidence, exaggeration, or myth, yet the evidence remains stubborn. Star charts that align too perfectly, mathematical systems too refined, myths that read less like stories and more like records. Each clue suggests something foundational has been omitted. The most unsettling part is not the mystery itself, but the silence around it. Few are willing to ask why this question is rarely explored, because if the timeline is wrong here, then the structure of human history becomes fragile. Egypt occupies a privileged position in the human story. For generations, it has been presented as civilization's first great awakening, the moment humanity stepped out of prehistory and into permanence. Monumental stone architecture, divine kingship, written language, and astronomical precision all appear neatly packaged along the Nile. It is a beginning that feels orderly, photogenic, and comfortably distant, but this confidence hides a quiet contradiction. Long before the first pyramid cast its shadow, Sumerian cities were already thriving, writing laws, mapping the heavens, and organizing complex societies. Their records are older, yet they are rarely treated as the true starting line. Instead, Egypt is framed as the origin, while Sumer becomes an inconvenient prologue. Part of the reason lies in visibility. Egypt left behind stone on a monumental scale, while Sumer wrote on fragile clay. Temples crumble, tablets break, and what survives shapes belief. Another reason is narrative simplicity. Egypt fits neatly into a story of gradual progress. Sumer disrupts it, arriving too early, too advanced, too sudden. Historians insist this preference is harmless, a matter of emphasis rather than omission. Yet cracks appear when timelines are compared side by side. Egyptian systems echo Sumerian ones. Deities resemble earlier gods. Knowledge seems inherited, not invented. Choosing Egypt as the beginning creates order. Questioning that choice invites chaos, and so the older evidence is quietly pushed aside, not disproven but politely ignored. The result is a past smoothed into comfort, while deeper origins remain buried beneath academic certainty and institutional silence. When the timelines of Sumer and Egypt are placed side by side, something strange begins to emerge. It is not a single coincidence, but a pattern that repeats too often to dismiss. Architectural principles align. Astronomical knowledge overlaps. Mythological figures seem to migrate across cultures, changing names but retaining their roles. The problem is not that these similarities exist. The problem is that no one seems comfortable explaining why. Sumerian ziggurats and Egyptian pyramids were not just monuments. They were precise instruments aligned with the heavens. Both cultures track stars with uncanny accuracy, embedding celestial cycles into stone and ritual. These were not simple observations made by farmers staring at the sky. They required long term data, advanced mathematics, and a conceptual understanding of the cosmos that feels shared. The overlap deepens in mythology. Creator gods descending from the sky, divine beings granting knowledge, sacred laws delivered to chosen intermediaries. These themes do not appear once or twice, but persist across civilizations that are supposed to be separate. Later religious traditions quietly inherit these same structures, reframing ancient gods as angels, watchers, or messengers. Official explanations call this coincidence cultural diffusion or universal human imagination. Yet these answers feel thin when examined closely. Why do the details align so precisely? Why do numbers, symbols, and celestial references repeat with such consistency? This is where the conversation usually stops, not because the evidence vanishes, but because the implications become uncomfortable. A shared source suggests connection. Connection implies transmission, and transmission demands an origin point that history has not named. The overlap remains forbidden not because it lacks evidence, but because following it leads somewhere no one has officially agreed to go. Sumer does not behave like a civilization finding its way forward through trial and error. It appears suddenly, already complex, already organized, already confident in its understanding of the world. Around 6,000 years ago, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates, cities emerged with writing systems, codified laws, advanced irrigation, and an organized priesthood. There are no clear ruins of experimentation beneath them, no visible childhood of civilization, just arrival. Cuneiform writing, one of humanity's earliest scripts, does not begin with crude symbols and slowly evolve. It enters the record capable of accounting, storytelling, astronomy, and theology almost immediately. The same is true of Sumerian law. Rules governing trade, property, marriage, and punishment appear structured and refined, not improvised. Astronomy deepens the mystery. Sumerian records show detailed tracking of celestial bodies, including cycles that require generations of observation. This kind of precision normally takes centuries to accumulate, yet it is present from the beginning. Historians acknowledge the problem quietly. Something is missing from the record. The developmental steps we expect simply are not there. The usual explanation suggests earlier evidence was lost to time, eroded by floods and fragile materials, but this explanation feels incomplete. Lost evidence should leave traces. Here the trail feels cut. Sumer's sudden sophistication forces an uncomfortable pause. It does not look like the first chapter of civilization. It looks like a continuation, as if knowledge had already been learned elsewhere, long before Sumer's cities ever rose from the mud. Among the most unsettling documents left by the Sumerians is the King List. At first glance, it appears straightforward, a record of rulers and dynasties, but as the names scroll backward into deep antiquity, the numbers become impossible. Kings ruling for 20,000 years, others reigning for tens of thousands more. According to the list, this era ended abruptly with a great flood. Modern historians are quick to label these reigns symbolic or mythological. They argue that ancient people exaggerated time to glorify their rulers, yet this explanation struggles under scrutiny. The list is otherwise precise, transitioning cleanly from impossible reigns to historically verifiable kings without any change in format or tone. The Sumerians themselves did not treat this list as allegory. It was a record, preserved and copied with care. The phrase kingship descended from heaven appears repeatedly, suggesting authority was not seized or inherited, but granted. The flood narrative adds another layer. Similar flood stories appear later in biblical and regional traditions, echoing the same structure and themes. Destruction, survival, and renewal. If these stories are purely symbolic, why do they align so closely across cultures? The King List sits in an uncomfortable space between myth and memory. Dismissing it as fantasy feels convenient. Taking it literally feels dangerous, but ignoring it entirely leaves a gap where history should be, a gap filled with questions that refuse to stay buried. Sumerian mathematics was built on a base 60 system, a structure so efficient it still governs how humans measure time and angles today. This was not accidental brilliance. It was deliberate design. They could calculate areas, volumes, and complex divisions with ease. Such systems usually emerge slowly through generations of problem solving. In Sumer, they arrive ready. Their understanding of the sky is even more troubling. Sumerian texts describe planetary movements with accuracy that implies long-term observation and record keeping. They identified planets by behavior, not superstition, separating wandering stars from fixed ones. This requires patience, consistency, and advanced conceptual thinking. Engineering follows the same pattern. Massive irrigation networks transformed hostile land into agricultural powerhouses. City layouts reveal planning, foresight, and centralized control. These were not villages growing naturally, they were engineered environments. The question is not whether the Sumerians were intelligent, it is how they acquired such layered knowledge so quickly. Innovation usually leaves fingerprints, failed attempts, gradual refinement. In Sumer, the fingerprints are faint. This leads to a disturbing implication. Knowledge appears transferred, not discovered, as if the Sumerians inherited frameworks already tested, already proven. If so, the true origin of that knowledge lies outside the visible timeline, in a chapter humanity has either forgotten or chosen not to read. Sumer forces historians into explanations that grow increasingly strained. When a civilization appears too advanced, too early, the timeline itself begins to bend. Standard models rely on gradual development, but Sumer refuses to cooperate. Each solution creates another problem. Some suggest lost precursor cultures, now completely erased. Others propose sudden intellectual leaps with no clear cause. These answers keep the structure intact, but avoid the deeper question. If Sumer was not the beginning, then what was? This is the first true break in the official timeline. Egypt may feel safer, more complete, but Sumer stands earlier, older, and less accommodating. It challenges the narrative that civilization rose once and only once in a clean upward motion. Acknowledging Sumer as a continuation rather than a starting point opens dangerous territory. It suggests forgotten ages, erased catastrophes, or influences humanity does not fully understand. It implies that history has layers beneath its accepted surface. Once this crack appears, it spreads. If Sumer inherited knowledge, then someone taught them. If someone taught them, then humanity's story stretches further back than textbooks allow. This is where certainty ends and discomfort begins, because beyond Sumer lies not clarity, but silence. And silence in history is rarely empty. In the oldest Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki are not introduced as abstract spirits or distant metaphors. They are described as beings who arrive, who rule, who command, and who leave. Their name itself is translated as those who came from the heavens, a phrase that sounds poetic until it is repeated with unsettling consistency. across texts meant to record reality, not fantasy. These beings are depicted as powerful authorities who establish order, distribute kingship, and oversee humanity's earliest cities. They are not prayed to in the same way later gods are. They are obeyed. The tablets describe physical interactions, instructions given, tasks assigned, and punishments enforced. The tone is administrative, almost bureaucratic. What makes this disturbing is the lack of distance. The Anunnaki are not placed in a dreamlike realm beyond reach. They walk among humans, descend from the sky, and depart upward again. They possess tools, vehicles, and knowledge beyond human capability. They are shown measuring land, manipulating environments, and deciding human fate. Skeptics insist this is symbolic language, the imagination of early minds trying to understand nature. Yet symbolism usually shifts and exaggerates. Here, the descriptions remain precise and repeated. The Anunnaki are not many things. They are one thing, described the same way over centuries. If these texts are taken at face value, the Anunnaki are not gods in the modern sense. They are something closer to overseers, beings with authority rooted in capability rather than divinity, and that possibility pulls the story of Sumer even further away from comfort and into uncertainty. Sumerian creation stories do not read like poetry. They read like procedures. Humanity is not born through divine breath or spontaneous magic, but through deliberate steps. Materials are gathered. Processes are tested. Failures are acknowledged. Adjustments are made. The language is methodical, unsettlingly so. In these texts, humans are created to solve a problem. The Anunnaki are burdened with labor, particularly mining and resource extraction. To relieve themselves, they design a workforce, a lesser being formed from earthly material and divine essence, engineered for obedience and endurance. This is not a story of love or salvation. It is a story of utility. Humans are made to work, to serve, to maintain systems already in place. The creation process involves precise actions overseen by specific figures, carried out according to a plan. Modern readers are told this is myth, yet myths usually explain morality or existence. This explains function. Even the emotional tone is cold. There is no celebration of humanity's birth, only relief that labor has been outsourced. The disturbing question is not whether this story is true, but why it is so technical. Why does it lack metaphor? Why does it describe creation like a project report rather than a spiritual revelation? If ancient people invented these stories, they imagined themselves not as chosen children of gods, but as tools. That is a strange fantasy to invent unless it reflects something remembered rather than imagined. The moment these texts are translated literally, discomfort enters the room. Words like descended, ascended, crafted, and commanded appear repeatedly. Taken plainly, they suggest action, movement, and intention. To soften the impact, translations often become interpretive rather than direct. Beings become forces, commands become inspirations, technology becomes symbolism. This approach is defended as scholarly responsibility, protecting modern readers from anachronistic conclusions. But critics argue it also protects the timeline. Literal translations raise questions that cannot be easily answered. If the Anunnaki are physical, then history changes. If they are not divine metaphors, then ancient people were recording encounters, not inventing myths. Academia operates on consensus. Ideas that disrupt foundational assumptions face resistance, not always through debate, but through dismissal. Researchers who push literal interpretations often find themselves isolated, their work labeled fringe, regardless of its textual accuracy. This does not prove suppression, but it reveals discomfort. Certain translations are safer than others. Certain questions lead nowhere productive within established frameworks. The result is a softened past, one filtered to fit expectation. Whether this is caution or damage control depends on perspective, but the effect is the same. The more literal the text becomes, the more quickly the conversation is redirected away from its implications. At a certain point, the boundary between myth and memory begins to blur. Ancient people did not categorize their experiences as modern humans do. They recorded what mattered using language available to them. Symbolism and description often coexist, not because one replaces the other, but because both are needed. If the Anunnaki were advanced beings beyond human understanding, symbolic language would be unavoidable. Fire becomes divine light. Machines become chariots. Authority becomes godhood. Memory reshapes reality, but does not erase it. Across cultures, similar stories emerge. Beings from the sky, knowledge delivered suddenly, humanity altered or instructed. These are not isolated tales. They echo globally, suggesting a shared root rather than independent invention. The possibility that these myths preserve distorted memories is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that ancient people were merely imaginative. It suggests they were witnesses, recording events through lenses shaped by fear, reverence, and limited comprehension. If so, the Anunnaki are not gods or aliens in the way modern media imagines. They are something older, something outside categories. And once that door opens, history stops being a straight line and becomes a layered archive of encounters we no longer fully recognize. The question is no longer whether these stories are true, but what humanity chose to forget when it decided they were not. When Egypt enters the historical record, it does not stumble into existence. It arrives with confidence, coherence, and astonishing capability. Within a remarkably short span, monumental architecture, complex theology, centralized governance, and advanced craftsmanship appear along the Nile. There is little evidence of slow experimentation. Like Sumer before it, Egypt seems to wake up already knowing who it is. Early dynastic Egypt shows mastery over agriculture, geometry, medicine, and administration. Hieroglyphic writing appears structured from the start, capable of expressing abstract religious ideas and detailed state records. This level of sophistication normally requires centuries of refinement, yet Egypt presents it almost immediately. What unsettles historians is the timing. Egypt's rise follows Sumer's peak, not humanity's infancy. The knowledge Egypt displays feels inherited, as though a blueprint already existed. Architectural planning, ritual symbolism, and celestial alignment do not emerge randomly. They mirror earlier systems seen in Mesopotamia, but refined and monumentalized. Traditional explanations credit environmental advantages or sudden social organization. The Nile, we are told, made it possible, but rivers do not teach geometry or encode theology in stone. They do not explain why Egypt's earliest achievements are also its most impressive. The leap forward creates the same silence found in Sumer, missing steps, unseen teachers. A civilization that does not look like a beginning, but a continuation, carefully adapted to a new landscape at a slightly later moment in a story already underway. That unanswered gap continues to disturb scholars who expect origins, not echoes. At civilization's dawn, there still. Egyptian religion appears richly symbolic on the surface, filled with animal forms, cosmic imagery, and elaborate myth. But when examined closely, its gods begin to look strangely familiar. Roles, hierarchies, and powers echo those found earlier in Sumer, raising uncomfortable questions about originality. Gods like Osiris, Thoth, and Ra are not distant abstractions. They rule, judge, teach, and intervene. Thoth, the god of knowledge, writing, and measurement, mirrors the Sumerian figures who deliver civilization itself. Ra's solar authority echoes celestial rulers, described in Mesopotamian texts. Even the concept of divine kingship follows the same logic. Authority descends from the gods to chosen rulers. The similarities go beyond theme. Symbols align. Winged discs, sacred boats, cosmic mountains, and judgment halls appear across cultures, separated by geography and supposedly by origin. These are not vague parallels, they are structural. Historians argue that ideas travel, that cultures borrow, yet borrowing usually leaves signs of adaptation. Here, the transfer feels clean, deliberate, almost planned. Egyptian gods feel less invented than reassigned. What is most troubling is how rarely this comparison is emphasized. The parallels are acknowledged, then quickly minimized. Independent development is favored even when evidence strains under that explanation. If Egyptian gods mirror older figures, then Egypt is not inventing belief, it is inheriting it, reshaping ancient authority into a new cultural language. That inheritance suggests a deeper lineage of influence, one stretching backward beyond Egypt's golden age into a shadowed past few are willing to map openly. Egypt's monuments create a problem modern explanations struggle to resolve. The Great Pyramid alone contains stone blocks weighing tens of tons, cut and fitted with precision, that remains difficult even with contemporary machinery. The tolerances are exact. The alignments are near perfect. This is not crude ancient effort. It is controlled execution. Beyond construction, astronomical precision deepens the mystery. Temples align with solstices and stellar risings. The pyramids mirror celestial patterns with deliberate intent. This requires long-term observation, mathematical accuracy, and a conceptual model of the sky that should have taken generations to refine. Standard explanations rely on manpower and ingenuity. Thousands of workers, simple tools, remarkable determination, but determination does not explain millimeter precision across vast structures, nor does it explain why the earliest monuments are the most complex, while later ones decline in quality. This inversion troubles researchers. Technology usually improves over time. In Egypt, it appears to degrade. The oldest achievements stand unmatched, as though later builders were copying something they no longer fully understood. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if Egyptians were not inventors, but inheritors? What if the knowledge required to build these structures was passed down incomplete from an earlier source? If so, Egypt's greatness becomes something different, not the dawn of human genius, but a remarkable attempt to preserve and replicate a legacy whose true origins were already slipping beyond reach. Egypt offers history something rare. It is ancient, but not destabilizing. Its monuments inspire awe without forcing uncomfortable questions about human origins. Its gods can be framed as myth. Its achievements can be credited to human perseverance. This makes Egypt safe. Compared to Sumer, Egypt fits more easily into a linear story. Civilization rises, matures, and leaves monuments behind. The timeline feels orderly. The gaps feel manageable. Sumer, by contrast, arrives too early, too advanced, and too strange. By positioning Egypt as the beginning, historians preserve structure. They avoid confronting the possibility of lost ages or external influence. Egypt becomes a foundation stone, not a continuation. This choice is rarely presented as deliberate. It emerges through emphasis, curriculum, and repetition. Over time, Egypt becomes the starting line by default. Earlier evidence fades into specialist debate, away from public awareness. The result is a simplified origin story, one that protects certainty. Egypt anchors civilization firmly within human capability. Sumer threatens to pull it backward into ambiguity. Choosing Egypt is not about denying evidence. It is about maintaining coherence. But coherence comes at a cost, because once Egypt is questioned as the beginning, the timeline loosens. And if Egypt is not the first great civilization, then history is not a straight ascent. It is a fragmented inheritance, shaped as much by what survived as by what was quietly set aside. The Knights Templar are remembered as warriors in white cloaks, sworn to protect pilgrims and defend sacred land. But this image captures only the surface of what they were. Beneath the armor was an organization unlike anything medieval Europe had seen. The Templars were administrators, financiers, scholars, and collectors of knowledge, operating across borders with a level of coordination that rivaled kings. They created one of the first international banking systems, allowing wealth to be transferred safely across continents. They managed land, libraries, and logistical networks with extraordinary efficiency. Such sophistication did not emerge accidentally. It suggests education, planning, and access to information far beyond the norm of the era. What sets the Templars apart is how quickly they rose and how independently they operated. Answerable only to the Pope, they existed outside local law, beyond royal control. This autonomy gave them freedom, not just to fight, but to search. And search they did, often in places considered spiritually dangerous or forbidden. Contemporary accounts hint that the Templars valued texts and relics as much as territory. They were collectors, translators, and preservers. In an age defined by superstition, they quietly pursued understanding. This dual identity, warrior and scholar, creates tension. Orders focused solely on combat do not build libraries. Financial institutions do not usually excavate sacred ruins. The Templars were something else entirely, and their true mission may have had less to do with protecting pilgrims and more to do with guarding and perhaps uncovering knowledge humanity was never meant to rediscover. When the Templars were granted control of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they gained access to one of the most symbolically charged locations on earth. Officially, they were housed there for protection. Unofficially, they spent years excavating beneath its foundations. Almost nothing survives in formal records about what they uncovered. That silence is what fuels suspicion. Chroniclers mention tunnels, vaults, and chambers long sealed. Later traditions speak of relics recovered from the depths, objects, texts, knowledge, tied not just to Judaism or Christianity, but to something far older. The Temple Mount was built atop layers of history, each civilization constructing over the last. If anything ancient survived anywhere, it would be there. Legends suggest the Templars believed the Ark of the Covenant, or records of divine encounters, were hidden below. Others whisper of texts describing humanity's true origins. What is certain is that after their time in Jerusalem, the Templars changed. They returned to Europe wealthier, more influential, and more secretive. Their power expanded rapidly, outpacing explanation. The Church offers no clarification. Excavation records are absent. Discoveries, if any, were never cataloged publicly. For an order otherwise meticulous in documentation, this absence feels deliberate. The idea that the Templars found nothing strains belief. The question is not whether they discovered something beneath the Temple Mount, but whether what they found threatened established narratives enough to require permanent silence. The fall of the Knights Templar was sudden and ruthless. One day they were indispensable. The next they were declared heretics. Arrests came without warning. Confessions were extracted under torture. Assets were seized. The order was dismantled with astonishing speed. Such efficiency suggests preparation. Accusations of blasphemy and secret rituals were vague, inconsistent, and often contradictory, yet they served their purpose. The Templars were destroyed not through debate, but through fear. What made them so dangerous? Their military strength alone does not explain the coordinated effort to erase them. Kings had fought armies before. This was different. This was annihilation. One theory persists beneath the official narrative. The Templars possessed knowledge that undermined authority. Not political secrets, but historical ones. Information that challenged the Church's control over origins, faith, and divine legitimacy. If they uncovered texts linking biblical tradition to older civilizations or records predating accepted scripture, the implications would be explosive. Faith is built on foundations. Undermine those foundations and power collapses. By destroying the Templars, their enemies erased a problem without having to confront it publicly. The knowledge itself did not need to be disproven. It only needed to be silenced. The brutality of their end suggests panic rather than justice. And panic in history often signals that something far more dangerous than rebellion was at stake. Despite the order's destruction, the story does not end with disappearance. Too much knowledge had been gathered, too many connections made. Legends insist that not everything was seized, not everything destroyed. Templar ships vanished from ports days before arrests began. Members fled to Scotland, Portugal, and beyond. New orders emerged bearing suspicious similarities. Symbols survived, quietly migrating into architecture, ritual, and encoded tradition. If the Templars possessed dangerous knowledge, it would not have been stored in a single place. It would have been fragmented, hidden, protected through dispersal. That is how secrets survive purges. Some believe this knowledge eventually flowed into the Vatican, absorbed into archives where access could be controlled indefinitely. Others argue it was hidden in plain sight, woven into symbolism. Few know how to read. What matters is not where the secret went, but that it did not vanish. Ideas rarely die with their carriers. They adapt. The destruction of the Templars may have been successful in one sense. The order ceased to exist. But if their mission was preservation, then they may have succeeded anyway, because the most powerful secrets are not those that shock immediately, but those that wait, dormant until humanity is ready or desperate enough to ask the questions they were meant to answer. Beneath the Vatican lies a place few will ever enter, and even fewer will speak about freely. The Vatican secret archives, now formally renamed but no less guarded, stretch for miles beneath Rome, holding centuries of documents locked away from public scrutiny. Access is not merely limited. It is controlled with precision. Scholars must apply, justify, and accept that entire categories of material will remain permanently off limits. This level of restriction raises a troubling question. What kind of knowledge requires protection not just from theft, but from awareness itself? Most archives preserve history. This one filters it. Entire eras are sealed behind permissions that rarely extend beyond carefully selected specialists. The Church explains this secrecy as preservation. Ancient documents are fragile. Misinterpretation could spread confusion. Context matters. These reasons sound reasonable until one considers how many empires have preserved archives without sealing them from humanity entirely. The Vatican does not merely guard religious doctrine, it guards correspondence with kings, records of heresies, transcripts of forbidden debates, and texts inherited from collapsed orders like the Templars. This is not just a library, it is a map of power. What unsettles critics is not what is known to be inside, but what is not acknowledged at all. Lists exist of documents no longer cataloged. Gaps appear where continuity should exist. A locked room invites speculation by its very existence. If nothing dangerous were inside, access would not need to be so carefully rationed. The more tightly the Vatican guards its archives, the more it suggests that history itself, not just faith, lies behind those sealed doors. Over the centuries, a handful of scholars have been granted rare access to restricted sections of the Vatican archives. Their experiences, when shared at all, are vague and cautious. Many speak of texts they were not allowed to copy, quote, or reference after leaving. Some were never invited back. These testimonies follow a familiar pattern. Ancient manuscripts that do not align neatly with accepted timelines. Letters describing theological debates abruptly shut down. Records of discoveries deemed dangerous to the faithful. The details remain elusive, but the tone is consistent. Something exists that resists categorization. Critics argue these accounts are exaggerated, fueled by imagination and disappointment, but the consistency of these stories across centuries makes dismissal difficult. Scholars from different eras, backgrounds, and beliefs describe the same experience, access granted briefly, then revoked without explanation. What is particularly telling is what does not happen. The Vatican does not publicly refute specific claims. It does not release contested documents to end speculation. Silence becomes the answer. For researchers, this silence carries weight. Academia relies on transparency. Claims are challenged through evidence. When evidence is inaccessible by design, debate collapses. If these documents were harmless, their release would strengthen faith, not weaken it. Instead, they remain sealed, not forgotten, but deliberately unreachable. The effect is chilling. Knowledge glimpsed, then removed, leaves a deeper mark than ignorance. It suggests not only that something exists, but that humanity is not trusted to interpret it safely. One argument often raised in defense of secrecy is responsibility. Knowledge, it is said, can destabilize societies. Certain truths, once revealed, cannot be contained. From this perspective, hiding information is not tyranny, but stewardship. If documents exist that challenge humanity's understanding of its origins, the consequences could be profound. Religious belief systems could fracture, cultural identities could dissolve, social cohesion might weaken. In this light, secrecy becomes a form of protection. History offers examples where sudden revelations caused chaos, political upheaval, religious schism, violence. The Vatican may see itself as preventing a greater catastrophe by controlling the narrative carefully, releasing truth gradually, if at all. Yet this reasoning raises ethical questions. Who decides what humanity can handle? At what point does protection become manipulation? Faith built on omission is still faith, but it rests on unstable ground. Critics argue that withholding knowledge infantilizes society, that growth requires confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Shielding humanity from its past may delay collapse, but it also delays understanding. The tension between faith and catastrophe is not new. Religious institutions have long walked this line. But when the subject shifts from doctrine to history itself, the stakes change. If the Vatican hides knowledge not to preserve power, but to prevent societal unraveling, the act becomes more complex but no less troubling, because a truth withheld out of fear still remains a truth waiting to be faced. Control over information grants influence. Control over history grants authority. If the Vatican possesses documents that alter humanity's timeline, then it holds power beyond theology. It shapes reality. Chronology is not neutral. Where history begins defines meaning. Origins frame identity by emphasizing certain eras and minimizing others. Institutions guide perception without altering a single artifact. The chilling idea is not that history was erased, but rearranged. Events reframed, origins repositioned, gaps quietly widened. By selecting what becomes foundational, the past itself is curated. This does not require falsification, only emphasis. Egypt over Sumer scripture over earlier myth, continuity over rupture. Over time, the curated version becomes truth through repetition. If documents exist that place civilization's roots deeper than accepted history allows, releasing them would unravel carefully constructed narratives. Faith would have to adapt, authority would have to justify itself anew. By controlling time, institutions control legitimacy. The Vatican's authority rests on a specific sequence of events, a divine order unfolding across history. Disrupt that order, and the structure trembles. Whether intentional or inherited, the result is the same. History becomes a locked room, and the key is held by those who decide what humanity is ready to remember. The most powerful secret may not be a single document, but the silent decision to let time itself tell only part of its story. The hidden timeline theory does not begin with monuments or kings. It begins with intelligence. Before Sumer, before Egypt, before recorded history itself, it proposes the existence of an advanced source of knowledge that does not fit into human development as we understand it. This intelligence does not emerge slowly. It appears suddenly, already capable, already authoritative. In this sequence, the Anunnaki are not mythic embellishments, but intermediaries. They arrive as administrators of this older intelligence, establishing systems, laws, and hierarchies. Humanity is not discovered wandering aimlessly. It is organized, directed, integrated into a framework already in place. Sumer becomes the first visible receiver of this structure. Writing, astronomy, mathematics, and governance are introduced not as inventions, but as implementations. Sumer records, preserves, and transmits this knowledge forward. Egypt follows, inheriting fragments of the same system. The gods change names, symbols adapt, architecture monumentalizes what was once functional. The knowledge becomes ritualized, mythologized, and increasingly symbolic as direct understanding actually fades. Finally, modern religion emerges, absorbing earlier myths and reframing them through theology. Gods become singular, overseers become angels, knowledge becomes revelation. The timeline compresses complexity into belief. This sequence is forbidden not because it lacks logic, but because it repositions humanity. We are no longer originators. We are inheritors. Civilization becomes a relay, not a genesis. And that shift changes how we understand everything that follows. If the alternative timeline holds even partially true, it destabilizes the foundations of modern belief. Theology relies on a specific order of creation. Humanity made first, then guided, then redeemed. Introduce an older intelligence, and that structure fractures. Human origins shift from divine creation or random evolution to intervention. Purpose becomes imposed rather than discovered. Free will becomes complicated. If knowledge was given, not earned, then progress is not linear. It is remembered. Power structures also tremble. Institutions derive authority from origins. Churches claim legitimacy through divine sequence. States claim it through historical continuity. Rewrite the beginning, and legitimacy must be renegotiated. Science, too, is affected. Human intelligence becomes less mysterious, but more unsettling. Genius is no longer purely internal, it is catalytic, triggered by exposure rather than invention. Most destabilizing is the psychological impact. Humanity prefers to believe it climbed alone. The alternative suggests we were lifted, then left to struggle with fragments. This is why the timeline is dangerous, not because it proves extraterrestrial involvement or ancient gods, but because it challenges autonomy. It suggests that what we call history is a residue of something larger, something unfinished. Accepting this does not provide comfort, it removes it. It turns faith into adaptation, progress into archaeology, and identity into inheritance. That is not an easy truth to absorb. One of the most troubling aspects of the hidden timeline is how widely it appears. Myths from unrelated cultures describe the same sequence: beings descending from the sky, knowledge delivered suddenly, humanity altered, instructed, or corrected. In Mesopotamia, it is the Anunnaki. In Mesoamerica, feathered serpents arrive bearing law and science. In India, gods descend in flying vehicles wielding weapons that sound uncomfortably technological. In Africa and the Pacific, ancestral beings arrive from the heavens and depart after shaping humanity. Symbols repeat: winged figures, serpents, cosmic mountains, floods resetting civilization. These are not vague similarities, they are structural echoes. Texts separated by oceans describe creation as labor management. Gods complain of work, humans are created to relieve burden. This theme appears too consistently to be dismissed as coincidence. Even numbers recur: sacred measurements, astronomical cycles, calendars aligning with precession long before it was officially discovered. These cultures had no contact, yet they preserved the same memory in different languages. That consistency suggests either an impossible coincidence or a shared source. The scattered evidence does not point to one location, but to one event. A moment in deep antiquity when something happened that humanity recorded the only way it could. Over time, memory decayed into myth. But myth, repeated globally, becomes a map. And this map points backward, beyond accepted history, toward a story that refuses to disappear. At some point, coincidence becomes statistically implausible. Independent cultures do not invent identical origin stories, symbols, and sequences without influence. Either humanity shares a psychological blueprint so precise it reproduces the same narrative everywhere, or something was deliberately preserved. Coordination does not require conspiracy in the modern sense. It can occur through inheritance, knowledge passed down selectively, symbols retained because they mattered, stories repeated because they explained something real. The darker possibility is suppression, that certain institutions recognized the pattern and chose to limit its interpretation, not by erasing evidence, but by reframing it as myth, allegory, or coincidence. This is more effective than destruction. Myths can be ignored. Allegories can be spiritualized. Evidence does not vanish. It simply loses urgency. If the hidden timeline was preserved deliberately, then someone understood its significance. If it was suppressed, then someone feared it. The global pattern suggests intent one way or another. Either ancient people worked to remember something critical, or later authorities worked to ensure it remained misunderstood. And the question is not which is true, but which is more unsettling. A humanity trying desperately to remember its origins, or a humanity quietly guided away from them. Because if the pattern is real, then history is not missing pieces by accident. It has been shaped. And once that possibility is acknowledged, the past becomes less about discovery and more about permission. Every field has its cautionary tales, and in historical research, they tend to surface quietly. Scholars who began their careers with promise, published respected work, and then suddenly disappeared from serious discussion. Their common thread was not incompetence, but curiosity that wandered too far from accepted boundaries. Some questioned the sudden appearance of ancient knowledge. Others examined myths too literally. A few tried to correlate archaeology with forbidden texts. The consequences were rarely dramatic. Grants were quietly denied, invitations stopped arriving, departments grew distant. In some cases, entire bodies of work were reclassified as speculative and excluded from citation. Public ridicule often followed. Once a researcher was labeled fringe, their arguments no longer needed to be addressed. Mockery replaced debate. This tactic was effective. Younger academics learned quickly which paths led to professional isolation. What makes these cases unsettling is how often the evidence itself remained solid. The problem was not flawed methodology, but implication. Their conclusions threatened consensus. Officially, academia prides itself on open inquiry. In practice, it operates on trust networks and shared assumptions. Step too far outside those assumptions, and the system reacts defensively. These scholars were not silenced by force. They were starved of oxygen. Their careers did not end in scandal, but in absence. The message was clear without being spoken. Question details, and you are welcome. Question the structure itself, and you may find yourself standing alone, wondering how quickly curiosity turned into professional exile. In theory, academia encourages questioning. In reality, it tolerates only certain kinds. Asking how a pyramid was built is acceptable. Asking whether the builders inherited lost knowledge is not. The difference is subtle, but the consequences are significant. There exists an invisible line in historical research. On one side lies healthy debate. On the other lies professional risk. Questions that challenge timelines, origins, or institutional narratives are considered radioactive. This boundary is rarely enforced openly. No rulebook lists forbidden topics. Instead, pressure is applied socially. Peer reviewers become hostile. Conferences reject papers without explanation. Colleagues advise caution for your own good. The system protects itself by framing dangerous questions as unserious. Once a question is labeled speculative, it no longer needs an answer. What makes this line difficult to detect is how it shifts. Ideas once dismissed can later become accepted, but only after being stripped of disruptive context. The insight is allowed, but the implication is not. Most scholars adapt. They learn to phrase questions carefully, avoiding conclusions that lead too far. This self-censorship is rarely acknowledged, but widely practiced. The line exists because history is not just academic. It supports identities, beliefs, and authority. Questioning its foundations threatens more than textbooks. Those who cross the line often do so unknowingly, believing evidence will protect them. They discover too late that some questions are not dangerous because they lack answers, but because of where the answers lead. In controversial research, evidence is rarely destroyed. It is neutralized, artifacts are reclassified, texts are reinterpreted, patterns are dismissed as coincidence. This approach avoids confrontation while maintaining control. Dangerous evidence is not evidence that is false. It is evidence that disrupts structure. A tablet suggesting advanced astronomy too early is not denied. It is contextualized. A myth resembling technological process is not disproven. It is spiritualized. This method is subtle and effective. The evidence remains visible, but its impact is reduced. Students learn about anomalies, but are taught not to linger on them. Labels do much of the work. Fringe, pseudoscience, speculative. Once applied, discussion ends. No counterargument is required. This does not imply malicious intent. Often it is institutional inertia. Paradigms resist change because change requires reconstruction. It is easier to dismiss than to rebuild, but the effect is the same. Evidence that challenges timelines is treated as hazardous material, handled briefly, then sealed away from deeper inquiry. The irony is that science advances by confronting anomalies, yet in history, anomalies threaten narrative cohesion. When evidence becomes dangerous, curiosity becomes risky. Researchers learn to focus on safe data, reinforcing the same conclusions repeatedly. The question then becomes not whether the evidence is valid, but whether humanity is willing to accept what it implies. And that question is far more uncomfortable than any artifact. The simplest question in research is often the most dangerous. What if the timeline is wrong? What if ancient people knew more than we think? What if something came before what we call the beginning? These questions do not assert conclusions, they invite exploration, yet asking them can carry real cost. Careers stall, reputations fracture, funding disappears. For some researchers, the price is worth paying. For most, it is not. This creates a feedback loop. The fewer people willing to ask foundational questions, the easier it becomes to label those who do as outliers. Curiosity becomes synonymous with recklessness. The tragedy is not censorship, but discouragement. Potential discoveries are never pursued. Hypotheses die quietly in notebooks. History then becomes conservative by default. It changes slowly, cautiously, always within acceptable bounds. Asking what if threatens those bounds. It suggests that certainty is provisional, that authority may be misplaced, that the past is less settled than presented. For institutions built on continuity, this is dangerous. The cost of curiosity is not paid all at once, it accumulates. A denied grant here, a rejected paper there. Eventually, the questioner learns to stop asking. And so the greatest loss is not suppressed truth, but unasked questions. Because history does not only forget through erasure, it forgets through fear. If humanity were forced to confront the possibility that it was not the first intelligent presence on Earth, or that its earliest knowledge was inherited rather than earned, the psychological shock would be profound. Human identity is built on a story of ascent. We survived, we learned, we progressed. This narrative gives meaning to struggle. It frames suffering as necessary and progress as deserved. Remove that foundation and uncertainty rushes in. If advanced beings existed before us or guided our development, then humanity's place in the universe shifts from central to secondary. Pride gives way to doubt. Purpose becomes unclear. Were we chosen, manipulated, or merely convenient? History shows how destabilizing such realizations can be. Even minor shifts in worldview have sparked panic, resistance, and violence. The idea that the earth was not the center of the universe was once enough to fracture societies. A revelation that civilization itself is not original could provoke something far deeper. For many, this knowledge would feel like loss, the loss of uniqueness, the loss of authorship over our own story. For others, it might feel like liberation. But large-scale psychological transitions are rarely smooth. Institutions understand this fragility. Stability often depends less on truth than on shared belief. When belief collapses faster than meaning can replace it, chaos follows. If humanity is not alone in its origins, then loneliness is replaced by uncertainty, not comfort. And uncertainty, when experienced collectively, can fracture trust, identity, and social cohesion in ways no single institution can easily repair. Power is not sustained by force alone. It is sustained by stories. Who we are, where we came from, and why authority exists all depend on narrative continuity. Control the origin story, and you control legitimacy. Governments trace power through ancestry and history. Religions trace it through divine sequence. Science traces it through evolutionary progression. All rely on a stable beginning. If that beginning is challenged, authority must be re-earned. Institutions that have governed for centuries would face questions they are not prepared to answer, not about policy or doctrine, but about relevance. This is why origins matter more than outcomes. A civilization that believes it built itself accepts its structures. A civilization that learns it was shaped by external forces may begin to question who benefits from forgetting that fact. Narrative control does not require lies, it requires emphasis. Certain stories are told loudly, others are reduced to footnotes. Over time, repetition becomes truth. Those who hold archives, curricula, and platforms shape perception without overt coercion. This influence is subtle but immense. If an alternative timeline undermines established hierarchies, suppressing it becomes an act of preservation, not conspiracy. Power protects itself instinctively. The danger is not that people would overthrow institutions overnight. It is that they would stop believing in their inevitability. Once origin stories are exposed as incomplete, authority becomes negotiable. And for those built on unquestioned continuity, negotiation is the beginning of decline. Few systems would be more affected by a revised timeline than religion. Faith traditions rely on sacred chronology: creation, fall, covenant, redemption. These sequences give meaning to belief and structure to morality, introduce a pre-human intelligence or ancient beings influencing humanity, and theology fractures. Creation becomes modification. Angels resemble administrators. Gods begin to look like overseers. For believers, this does not simply challenge doctrine, it challenges trust. If sacred texts are layered atop older stories, then revelation becomes reinterpretation. Some faiths might adapt, others would resist fiercely. History shows that when religious narratives are threatened, reaction is rarely calm. Schisms form, extremes harden. The danger lies not in disbelief, but in fragmentation. Shared belief systems provide social glue. When they fracture, identity splinters along cultural, ideological, and political lines. Religions could attempt to absorb the new timeline, reframing ancient beings as symbolic or subordinate, but such reinterpretation would feel forced to many. The overnight rewriting of faith would leave millions searching for meaning simultaneously. That vacuum could be filled by anything: charisma, extremism, despair. This is why religious institutions tend to move slowly, releasing change incrementally. Sudden revelation risk collapse. If the timeline were publicly revised, faith would not disappear, but it would mutate unpredictably. And history shows that unstable belief systems are among the most dangerous forces a society can unleash. Human progress is often celebrated as a march toward knowledge, but history suggests a more complicated truth. Some knowledge destabilizes faster than it enlightens. Some truths arrive before societies are ready to integrate them. If humanity learned it was part of a much older, unfinished story, the implications would ripple outward. Ethics, purpose, destiny, questions once abstract would become urgent. Who are we accountable to? What does progress mean if we are inheritors, not pioneers? Are we being observed, abandoned, or forgotten? Ignorance in this context becomes a shield, and not because truth is evil, but because timing matters. Knowledge without context creates fear. Those who guard history may believe they are delaying catastrophe, not denying truth, waiting for humanity to mature emotionally before confronting its origins. But delay has its own cost. Suppressed knowledge does not disappear. It returns distorted, mythologized, or weaponized. The risk is not knowing too much. It is knowing too suddenly, without preparation. Whether secrecy is protection or control depends on intent, but the outcome remains uncertain. Because if ignorance has been humanity's shield, it has also been its prison. And eventually, every prison door is tested. The question is not whether humanity can handle the truth. It is whether it can handle the consequences of discovering it all at once. Every generation believes it has reached the edge of understanding, yet the same questions keep resurfacing, refusing to stay buried. Civilizations rise, technologies advance, and archives expand, but the unease remains. The origin question never settles, it waits, reappearing whenever certainty grows too comfortable, reminding humanity that its foundation may not be as solid as assumed. This mystery matters because it strikes at identity. Who we are depends on where we began. A flawed origin story produces fragile meaning. When evidence hints at missing chapters, curiosity ignites again, regardless of how often it is dismissed or reframed by authority. The question survives because it addresses something unresolved. Historical mysteries endure not because they lack answers, but because answers feel incomplete. Each new discovery closes one gap while opening another. Sumer explains Egypt, but not itself. Egypt explains religion, but not its own inheritance. Progress reveals depth, not closure, pushing the question backward instead of forward. The mystery also persists because it resonates emotionally. Humans sense discontinuity in the past, moments where development accelerates unnaturally. These moments feel remembered rather than invented. They create cognitive friction, a quiet intuition that history is layered, not linear. As long as this intuition exists, the mystery will matter. It challenges complacency, resists final explanations, and survives every attempt to resolve it neatly. Some questions endure because they are wrong. Others endure because they are essential. This one belongs to the latter. Modern archaeology and theology present themselves as open disciplines, yet clear boundaries remain. Certain questions are acknowledged only to be sidelined. Others are never formally asked, not because they lack merit, but because they destabilize too much at once, forcing uncomfortable reconsideration of long-held assumptions. We can ask how ancient structures were built, but not who might have taught the builders. We can ask when texts were written, but not why similar stories appear globally. We can analyze myths, but questioning their origin as memory rather than metaphor crosses an invisible threshold. In theology, blind spots are even more pronounced. Sacred chronology is rarely challenged openly. Earlier influences are minimized. Parallels are explained away. The structure is protected by treating foundational questions as settled, even when evidence suggests ongoing uncertainty beneath the surface. Archaeology mirrors this pattern. Anomalies are cataloged but isolated. Outliers are acknowledged, then bracketed off. The broader implications are quietly avoided, not through censorship, but through specialization that prevents synthesis. What remains unasked shapes understanding as much as what is explored. Silence creates borders around thought, and as long as these borders remain intact, certain conclusions remain unreachable, not because they are wrong, but because the questions required to reach them are still considered unacceptable. Myth has long been treated as fiction, a creative attempt to explain the unknown. Memory, by contrast, is assumed to record reality. Yet, in ancient cultures, this distinction was rarely clear. Memory was preserved through story, symbolism, and ritual because no other tools existed to record extraordinary experiences. When ancient texts describe gods descending from the sky or reshaping humanity, modern readers default to metaphor. But metaphor does not explain consistency. Across continents, cultures separated by oceans preserved remarkably similar stories, using different names but identical structures, as if recalling a shared event through local language. Skepticism is necessary, but so is humility. Dismissing all ancient testimony as imagination assumes modern superiority of perception. It ignores the possibility that ancient people recorded real encounters using symbolic vocabulary because literal language did not yet exist. Memory erodes over time. Details blur, meaning shifts. Technology becomes magic, authority becomes divinity. What begins as experience transforms into myth, but traces of reality remain embedded within narrative. This is where the discomfort lies. If myth preserves distorted memory, then ancient texts are not fantasies. They are archives written in metaphor. Standing at this threshold, certainty dissolves. We are left suspended between disbelief and recognition, unable to fully reject, yet unable to fully accept. If one foundational assumption collapses, others follow. History is interdependent. Change the beginning, and the middle must adjust. The end becomes uncertain. A wrong timeline does not merely shift dates, it alters meaning, causation, and responsibility across the entire human story. If civilization inherited knowledge, then progress is not purely linear. If ancient intelligence existed, then humanity is not alone in its past. If institutions curated history, then certainty itself becomes provisional, dependent on access rather than truth. This realization does not demand belief, it demands awareness. Awareness that what is accepted today may be revised tomorrow. That confidence in history is often confidence in consensus, not completeness. The most unsettling outcome is not discovering new answers, but realizing how many questions were never pursued. What else was simplified? What else was filtered? What else remains misinterpreted because it challenged comfort or authority? The story does not end with revelation. It ends with unease. A recognition that history may be less a record of what happened and more a record of what survived. And if the timeline is wrong, then certainty itself becomes fragile. The question refuses to die because it does not seek an answer. It seeks permission to doubt, to re-examine, and to accept that humanity's past may be far stranger than its most carefully guarded explanations.